All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Lewis, again with the Eno Center for Transportation. Nat has arrived, and we're delighted to have Nat Beuse, who is the Associate Administrator for Vehicle Safety Research at NHTSA. Nat has been very much involved in the writing of the Federal Automated Vehicle Policy Statement, I think both in 2016 and the most recent update that we all anticipated and thoroughly read last month, and he is here to talk about it and give his perspectives on what is in the update and what we can anticipate going forward. He's going to talk for the next 15 minutes or so, and then I know we're starting a few minutes late, so we will extend this until 2:40. So sorry if there are some folks that have to leave the phone at 2:30, but we will we'll make sure that we have some time for questions. If you do have questions, please use the chat function in the question box. This is on the GoToWebinar panel, or you can email questions to publicaffairs@enotrans.org. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the call to Nat Beuse.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for Eno for hosting this. This is a really important part of not only the department's approach, but NHTSA's approach to ensuring that we have good communication going forward on what's going on with respect to AV policy. The development of the one release last September was previewed by a considerable amount of stakeholder outreach and stakeholder input, and not just by people coming into the building, but by also work that was being done by Transportation Research Board, actually some work being done by Eno actually as well, and others, and we actually used all of that input in crafting that sort of first version of the guidance. And we put it out for comment, and no surprise, folks had some things to say, but overwhelmingly it was a largely positive response. Folks really thought that the policy framework, the voluntary approach of the guidance, the message to states was really something that really helped kind of start a framework discussion for AV policy in the United States with respect to light vehicles. And so what we released in September, just a mere month ago, reflects that. It really reflects a refinement and a more focused effort on really what folks found the most, let's say, was the most useful, which was one, the section on vehicle performance guidance for vehicle manufacturers and other entities out there testing and deploying automated vehicles, and also the model state policy and the technical assistance to state legislatures. So I'll talk about each one of those separately. So for the vehicle performance guidance, what we really did there was respond to the comments. I mean, that'll be a constant theme you'll hear from me in this short talk. It's people spent a lot of time providing very good comments, and we took all that in. In fact, we were taking comments all the way up until after the comment period even closed, all the way up until March of this year. So when Secretary Chow came in and said, well, what is this thing and what are we doing with it? We could report to her just exactly where we were, and it was really under her leadership that she pushed us to get the next update out. And so what we've done is really focused on what I would call core safety elements. And so there are now 12 core safety elements in the vehicle performance guidance. And we removed, for further consideration down the road at some point, those that were just not ready for prime time, I would say. An example of that is the ethics one. No matter who you talk to in the AV world, people will say ethics and worry about the vehicle sort of careening off the road and killing an old lady or something like that, or people like to make the one about the baby in front of the vehicle. And all the comments said, yeah, that's a very important issue, but we're not sure how we would self-assess our system to some ethics, right? Everybody's going to make different decisions, and on top of that, that's not how engineers make decisions when they're programming these vehicles and these systems. And so that's one where, yeah, it made a lot of sense that that's one that needs a little bit more work before it's one that a company could self-assess their ways of meeting the guidance. The other big change, I would say, was the clarification that there was an approval process or something like that at the agency for a document that was known as the self-assessment, where it was largely misunderstood in comments that NHTSA was somehow approving the design aspects of vehicles, and we were never intending to do that. In fact, what we were trying to set up was a clearinghouse. And so what we've done now is just made that very explicit. Rather than a company explaining to us how they're meeting the guidance and then us making that information available to the public, it's a single transaction from the manufacturer or an entity to the public. There's not a NHTSA pass-through in the middle. And that would hopefully clarify that now it's really the companies making this information available and not some pass-through through the agency. And of course, the whole purpose of this is worth reiterating, is that it provides a framework for companies and other entities testing and deploying vehicles on the roadway to have a conversation with the public on how they're addressing safety beyond just, I drove 5 million miles today or in simulation and I didn't have an event. These are real concrete terms that have safety impacts. You know, you're talking about the design of the vehicle, how you're looking at cybersecurity, how the system considers when it's outside its design domain, and other issues like that. Kind of moving quickly to the state piece, there I would say it was mostly cleanup, with the exception of one strong notion, which was really taking a look at state legislatures. We realized both in terms of comments that we received, but also in terms of companies and state legislatures that were actually visiting the department over the last couple months, that they are looking for information. They would like to know, if I'm going to start legislation in this area, what should I be looking at? And so what we did was really look at bills that had passed when we talked to state legislature folks. They had passed with sort of a compromise or were consensus language bills. And so we thought that was a good model, right? Go around and look and see where were the bills that actually made sense and people agreed upon, and pull out the best practices out of those, and kind of provide that as a platform for kind of anybody else who's looking at this space. And we focus mainly on those things that would seem to alleviate what a lot of the concern was during the comments, which was about a patchwork approach at the state level to the regulation of automated vehicles. And so, you know, they really focus on what I would call maybe simple things, but unless you're in this every day, it wouldn't necessarily occur to you. So a good example of that is, you know, many states have registration procedures, but they're not necessarily run at the state level, let's say. And so if you're an entity looking to test in the state, what was happening was literally some people were going from county to county, you know, a guy in a district here to give permission to test, and that just seems very inefficient if you're looking for a framework that is a national deployed framework. Another example of that is really just doing what NHTSA had actually done on its own, is really looking within their own regulatory scheme to see where they might actually have barriers to a technology, not even knowing that it was there. You know, you have to do the homework to go look through the books to see what's in there before you can figure out if you have any barriers. And so it's really simple things like that versus focusing on what would be traditionally NHTSA's roles. You know, the software of the vehicle, how is the vehicle performing? Is it following all the proper traffic conditions and things like that? Those are all software issues that are embedded in the vehicle that are generally the responsibility of NHTSA and the federal government, and we are actively doing research in those very areas as we look towards the future. So I think, in summary, what you saw released in September was a really much more streamlined and much more focused document that really focused on kind of the best of the best from what was in the previous policy, and really incorporated a lot of the comments that we received. And I think that where we are going forward is a couple different places. So right now there's actually 3 dockets open. I'm not even sure folks actually realize that. So the first docket that's open is a docket that's just seeking comment on the general aspects of the voluntary guidance. This is not to say that we're looking to make additional changes or that we're not looking to make additional changes. It's really about what additional improvements can we make going forward. But I would say right now we're really focused on implementation, right? We had a nice document in September of last year. We put it out for comment. We made a lot of changes, and now it's really time to focus on implementation. And we already see the first aspects of that. Literally last week, you know, we had Waymo make available its version of a self-assessment on its website. They didn't give it to us. They gave it to put it out on the website and made available to the public. The other docket that's open is with respect to something called the Paperwork Reduction Act. You know, this is kind of inside Beltway stuff, but it's a process that we have to go through anytime we ask entities to document, even if it's for themselves, any sort of information. And so that docket is open, and we're going through that process right now. And then there's a third docket that's open, which has to do with what's called the voluntary self-assessment. And that is reference to both the document that an entity would make available to the public in terms of the types of information that might be useful, but also where that information is housed. And so that docket is open as well, and we're having a public meeting actually on that singular issue on Friday at DOT headquarters, and it will be webcast. The next big step will be a meeting that we're having on the 6th of November. This is where we'll likely bring together and hear comments from folks who are just generally wanting to know what's out there, what they think about the notice, and what they think about the actual voluntary guidance. And so that all of those have various ending closing dates, but my message to everyone is those closing dates are important because you got to have an end at some point, but it shouldn't be interpreted as no one can give us any comments after that. Like I said, if you look at the agency's behavior the last time around, we accepted comments. It was 4 months after the closing date of the docket, and I don't see us doing anything really differently this time around. And so in closing, it's also really important to note that this is just one piece of the NHTSA portfolio in terms of what we're working on AVs. I'm also responsible for the research program, and one of the things we're focusing on there is kind of different aspects of vehicle design and different aspects of possible test procedures and performance metrics for these vehicles. It's something that we've talked about before, and I don't really have time to go into today, but if folks have specific questions, I can obviously answer those. But it's important to know that we just didn't put guidance out there and we're kind of off doing nothing. There actually is a method here where the guidance is a framework, but we're also still very much focused on kind of concrete safety tests and other things. So happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Nat. For folks on the line, feel free to submit some questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. It should be open on your screen, or by emailing publicaffairs@enotrans.org. We've already received a number of questions, which is fantastic. We've got about 15 minutes to go through a couple of these, and one that's come up a couple times is the voluntary nature of the safety self-assessment.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks have been wondering, does that someday become a mandatory safety standard? Or is it something that NHTSA is envisioning always being kind of part of the voluntary regulatory space?
Yeah, so the tool of the voluntary self-assessment was really about public disclosure on real safety issues, as I mentioned, safety elements. Right now we're sort of really just executing the research program and not really focused on what might or might not be regulated. I think right now the technology is really in its infancy. Like right now there are no level 3 vehicles on the road, and so the guidance document really focuses more on those future vehicles. And that's why it's worth maybe just mentioning a little bit about the research that we're doing. So the research that we're doing is really focused on kind of 4 areas. One is looking at the existing set of standards and really making that translation. How do you run a compliance test on a vehicle that doesn't have a steering wheel and brake pedal, let's say? So we just initiated that work just last month. The other aspect that we're looking at is actually at the component level. So if you have an automated steering or an automated braking function, how do you test that system? We have a lot of experience doing that, but now it's a different kind of question. The third area is really looking at, okay, now if you start combining things and you have a system that takes steering and braking and you put them together, and now you can go from one state to the next state with no driver input, that's yet a different research question, and there are different issues associated with that kind of system, and so we're actively looking at that as well. And the last category is really what I think a lot of people imagine when they think of a level 4 or level 5 vehicle where we're all sitting in the back seat watching movies or something like that, or there's maybe no such thing as a back seat anymore. There we think there are maybe more novel research questions because of just the history of the automobile industry and where we've been, where all the assumptions assume kind of a certain direction, a certain seating configuration, and really almost starting at the basics, do our tools even measure that? So that's sort of where we're focused on the kind of design and performance aspects of the vehicle, and maybe not so much on the voluntary self-assessment. The other thing worth pointing out is that at least if you believe the comments, it seems that a large majority of the industry will already be implementing the guidance. I mean, like I said, already within a month of putting out the new guidance, Waymo comes out with its safety report, they called it, which is essentially there are elements of the self-assessment in there. And I suspect we'll hear more about that on Friday.
So a couple of the comments that we have are talking about the low-speed AV shuttles that are being piloted across the country.
Yeah.
Have any of those organizations submitted a self-assessment or any kind of documentation about their approach to safety?
They have not yet. No company had submitted one or made available to the public one before last week.
Got it. And kind of building on what you were just talking about, there's been a couple research papers, one from RAND and then a few others, suggesting that the design-based policy is perhaps not where we want to end up, and more on an evidence-based. I mean, you were talking about the performance measures.
Yeah.
Can you get into some of the specifics there and how you're thinking about the approach to this?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot written about you just can't drive your way out of it, essentially. This whole question of what is safe. One of the ways that we're looking at that is how are the different ways that you would assess safety. So there's obviously test track stuff that you need to do because there are scenarios that you can only run on a test track in a safe way. There's a lot of things you can do in simulation. You can run multiple scenarios very quickly. You can run very nuanced cases very quickly. But there's not good agreement in the community right now about what those scenarios even are, number one. But number two, what makes a good simulation. I think there's still some more research work needed on that front. And then there's sort of the plain old, we have a driving test and you have to pass it. A lot of folks equate that to like a driving test, and whatever happens, the driving test happens. So I would say we're not locking ourselves down to any of those. We're actually looking at all three of those, plus this idea of you just have some sort of generic performance test. I mean, in the end, you have to evaluate yourself against something. It's just not a concept. And so we're looking at all those in a very deliberate way, I would say, versus just focus on what I mentioned about, which is looking at individual components or looking at a system.
Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, we've got some questions about the AV bills that are going through the House and Senate. How do the laws, at least how they're currently written, affect NHTSA's role in the broader scheme of regulating automated vehicles, and what are your perspectives on those?
Yeah, I think that's an area of active conversation. We're engaged, the administration is engaged with the Congress on those, so I can't comment specifically on how those interact with us. But what I would say is that even with our voluntary guidance, we haven't taken any of the tools off the table. NHTSA is still on the job. We have our enforcement authority that we can use. There's a misconception out there, especially with some of our state partners, that believe we have to wait for lots of crashes or lots of fatalities before something rises to the level of a defect, and that's simply not true. There are many examples where we've either received a recall from a manufacturer or pursued lines of questioning with the manufacturer before there was any real-world event at all. And so I think that's something going forward we're going to need to further explain to not only the public, but really our state partners, that NHTSA is on the beat, right? We're the cop on the beat, and we have a lot of tools beyond just the regulatory tools that everyone seems to focus on sometimes to be able to influence safety in the United States. But all of that said, it's also a partnership with the vehicle manufacturers and other entities out there who, again, going back to the comments, so if you read their comments, seem to be focused on safety, and what's really been missing is they're not really talking about it. They didn't really have a platform to talk about it, so the self-assessment tool is one way to do that.
Got it. So then that's one thing that one of the big changes between the 2016 policy statement and the 2017 was that NHTSA, you had two sections in there about some of the enforcement powers that NHTSA has. Those were left out of the 2017 policy statement. Can you talk a little bit about what are NHTSA's enforcement powers and what could be there, and why the decision was made to leave those out?
Yeah, I think it was a decision that those other two sections sort of clouded the conversation a bit. The section on the current tools and authorities actually still exists. We actually just pulled it out and made it a separate resource. What we found in talking with stakeholders, and it's still a very real issue, is many of them aren't sure of exactly, if you were to, how do you request regulatory relief from NHTSA? And so, we didn't delete that whole thing. We just pulled it out of the voluntary guidance because there's nothing voluntary about our current powers, right? So I think that's some of the things, as we were getting the comments and, having a guidance document in the context of, wait, this is your regular tools and authority, and how does that all mesh together? So that's why it's not in there. The last section that was really more of a thought piece was really us exploring the conversation with the public, some conversation that we had with other agencies that are, dealing with all sorts of new technologies, people like FDA, people like FAA within the department and others. And so that section kind of was just more of a conversation starter versus something that we were going to pursue all these sort of new tools and authorities piece.
Got it. Another question that came up regarding the best practices. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's focused on best practices for states. Do you guys have any thoughts or any best practices for municipalities that want to get involved in this and that are seeing testing on their streets?
Yeah, that has come up in a couple different forums lately, and I think the answer I've given to that is it's sort of one reason why one of the recommendations we have is about the state kind of overseeing at the state level kind of the registration aspect of this, so that municipalities are having conversations with kind of within the border of the state versus trying to set up their own little program within a small geographical radius that may or may not be beneficial for deployment. And so very much they should be part of the conversation. This is testing that is happening on their streets, but they should be engaging in that conversation at the sort of the higher level versus making the decision down here and then realizing, oh, there was another policy over here that we probably should have implemented.
So a couple people have asked about automated vehicles and the environment.
Yeah.
Something that folks are both excited about, potentially reducing environmental impact, and then also concerned about increasing environmental impacts. Is this something that NHTSA is involved in, or is the environmental regulation outside of the scope of your agency?
No, I mean, of course, we're involved in CAFE and fuel economy standards and things like that. What I would say is we are starting to hear maybe some common themes of issues that kind of surround automated vehicles. And really, we're talking about the higher levels, level 4 and level 5, really sort of that future that's, not here yet. And, they involve things that might be tangentially related to safety or that could serve as a barrier to the deployment of these systems. And so we're having conversations right now within the department as a kind of across the modes, I would say, so across sister agencies, about what is our role with respect to some of those issues. So, for example, issues with the disability community and how these vehicles, these future vehicle designs may even how they impact those communities. And so there are many issues associated with that. It's not just a singular issue, a singular NHTSA safety issue. It's much broader than that. And so I think we're thinking through what are the best ways to kind of have the conversation started about that, so people can at least be able to talk about them, and so we can identify what the issues really are and then figure out what needs to happen. And so I would put the whole conversation that I know is out there about, it's either going to be a boon for mobility or it's going to be like terrible. And I think that's where that would fit in.
So on a slightly different subject, the issue of automated vehicles and data.
Yeah.
This is something that comes up. What are your thoughts about vehicle manufacturers sharing some kind of vehicle operating data with NHTSA or some kind of third party? Apparently, and this commenter said that NHTSA spoke about developing a system similar to the airline system, where companies share data and have some protection against the liability.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So let me talk about just sort of without kind of opining on what manufacturers should or should not do, but we've sort of broken down the data discussion into 3 bins. The first bin is what probably most people would identify with as crash reconstruction. So the vehicle gets into a crash, what data should be made available either for obviously law enforcement, for insurance companies, for the agency if there's an issue of defect or something like that. Some of that information is contained in what we would call today an event data recorder. Clearly that device or devices, let's say, did not envision a world where there's cameras and radars and LiDARs and maybe communications technology and map data, et cetera. And so one effort that we've recently initiated is to ask SAE to kind of start work in that area, much like they did the original event data recorder standard. As was an SE standard. What would that new one look like in this future state? Related to that, most people, I think, realize that the crash data that the agency gets is collected from police accident reports from the states. And so one of the things that we already launched on way last year even was to work with that community to figure out how would you, let's say, identify that on a police accident report, what are the different elements that would be in there. So since it's still early, there wasn't a lot that we could do with that, but at least there's now we'll call it a box in that form now for level 3, 4, 5 systems. The second piece is really about this, what I would call safety metrics. And this is really about not measuring crashes as a measure of performance or goodness, but something else. And so we're in conversations with a couple folks in the community about how to start the conversation on that and the work that would be necessary to develop this sort of new metric. Then the last category on data has to do with the whole idea of sharing, and this is the airline model that was mentioned. And so right now we're still kind of in the scoping phase of that, really trying to figure out what exactly it would mean for the auto industry. I mean, it took the airline industry 20+ years to get to their very mature system, and it has a lot of different aspects to it and a lot of different entities involved in it. Is there a way to start something similar on the auto side? And there are lots of conversations going on about that. There seems to be an interest, but there's also a lot of, challenges that need to be solved in order to make it happen. And so that's sort of how we've broken down the data discussion.
Great. We have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to start with one about preemption and the role of the federal government versus the role of the states. Something that comes up an awful lot.
Sure.
A few folks have asked about that. What is the how are we redefining different roles of different levels of government, or is this more or less a continuation of what we've traditionally had, and how do these affect the flexibility that states have to manage their own roadways?
Yeah, sure. So I think the way that we've laid out the voluntary guidance is, I guess in your words, would be like we've always had it. I think the issue has been a lack of understanding with some of our partners about how we actually do regulations and how our enforcement powers work. For example, I heard someone actually really recently say, well, you guys don't regulate software. And I looked at them saying, really? Go look at kind of even some of the basic safety standards we have now regulate software. So I think there's just not as much understanding about that issue in and of itself, software versus the mechanical thing. I think folks think we only regulate, tires and brakes or something like that, and not realize that if you look at something that's as sophisticated as stability control, it's a performance test, but it's actually regulating also how that system performs, which is essentially software, right? It applies different braking power to different wheels. So I think we don't see this big shift. I think what the big mental shift is, if a vehicle has some defect or some issue, who's responsible? And again, I think we think that's all still us. If it's a defect, something wrong with the software, that's going to fall to us. I think, we would like to figure out more from some of our partners about why they think that what we're doing is somehow different now. And I think there has been some confusion about what the Congress is talking about and kind of what NHTSA has been doing on the vehicle side.
Got it. And the last question should be a quick one, but it's one that's come up a couple times. Obviously, NHTSA has done a ton of work on automated vehicles and is increasingly under pressure to do more and more. Are you all opening a separate automated vehicle office or dedicating additional staff to this specific topic? And how are you handling the workload that's being pushed on because of the rapid development of the technology?
Yeah, I would say we have been in it for a while, right? I think actually it's funny that you mentioned my involvement in the last one, because I was actually involved in the first one back in 2013 that no one talks about anymore. must not have been a very good piece of work. But I think where we are now is sort of developing maybe a more mature research program. To be quite frank, I think where we started was we knew there was these issues like human factors issues. There was going to be system issues. There's electronics issues, and I think where we are now is really building on the knowledge of that work that was done, a couple of years ago, and now saying, okay, where do we need to go now? So I think we're maintaining what we're doing while adding on, yes, all these new issues. Congress gave us extra funds in 17 that really actually jump-started the whole work that we're doing right now, looking at the regulatory barriers. And for us, for my office, it's really not doing the regulatory work per se. It's really, again, looking at the test procedures that are on the books that say, run the test with the hands on the steering wheel. Well, if there's no steering wheel, how do you run the test? And so that's the work that my office would traditionally have done anyway. And so, thanks to Congress giving us the increase in funds, we're able to kind of get that work going sooner rather than later.
Great. Well, with that, we're out of time. We want to thank everybody for joining the call and thank Nat Beuse for joining us this afternoon and talking about the most recent policy statement. So, again, thanks everybody for joining, and we look forward to speaking with you next time.